The grand doors of the courtroom swung open. Two police officers escorted a young man inside, his hands tightly bound by cold steel handcuffs. The air in the room was stiflingly silent. Every gaze locked onto him. Marcus Reeves held his head high, stepping forward at an unhurried pace. Though he entered as the accused, there was no panic or fear in his demeanor. His sharp eyes scanned the courtroom, absorbing every detail. He knew that if he wanted to walk out of here a free man, he had to prove his innocence. From the high bench, Judge Richard Monroe leaned back in his chair, looking down at Marcus with thinly veiled judgment. He had presided over thousands of cases in his career and saw no reason why this one would be any different. A young black man accused of grand theft auto and assaulting an officer? Open and shut. With the evidence in hand, this trial would be over quickly. On the other side, Prosecutor Gerald Payne stood, adjusting the flawless lines of his suit. A seasoned attorney with an almost unbeatable record, Payne carried himself with unwavering confidence. He stepped into the center of the room, locking eyes with Marcus before turning to address the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice rang out with authority, we are here today to bring a dangerous criminal to justice. Pacing slowly, Payne let his gaze sweep across the jurors. The defendant, Marcus Reeves, was apprehended near the scene of a carjacking. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel, and more than that. He paused for dramatic effect before continuing. A police officer witnessed Marcus behind the wheel, fleeing the scene. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some nodded in agreement, while others cast wary glances at Marcus. In the back row, Eleanor Reeves, Marcus's mother, a sharp-witted attorney herself, clenched her hands tightly, fighting to stay composed. She knew her son was innocent, but truth and justice didn't always walk hand in hand. Marcus remained silent, unfazed. A faint smirk played on his lips. They thought he was just another young man unfamiliar with the law. But what they didn't know was that he had spent his entire childhood studying every inch of this system, and he was ready to prove them wrong. The air in the courtroom grew heavier as Prosecutor Gerald Payne declared with chilling clarity, if convicted, the defendant could face up to 10 years in prison. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Marcus remained composed, but a sharp glint flickered in his eyes. He couldn't allow himself to be crushed by a biased legal system. In the back row, his mother, Eleanor Reeves, a seasoned attorney, clenched her fists. She wanted nothing more than to stand up and defend her son, but the law forbade it. As a direct relative, she was barred from representing Marcus. Now he was alone, facing a trial that seemed rigged against him. Amid the storm raging in his mind, a decision sparked to life. Marcus would defend himself. He wasn't just any 20-year-old. As a child, he had spent countless hours in his mother's office, absorbing case after case, dissecting every law. He knew how easily the system could crush people like him, the poor, the young, the black. But he also knew that the law had loopholes, and he was going to use them. But could a 20-year-old really take on a seasoned prosecutor and a conservative judge? Judge Monroe peered down from the bench, his gaze cold and unwavering. Defendant Marcus Reeves, do you wish to proceed with a public defender, or will you represent yourself? Marcus's breath caught in his throat. This was the moment. He glanced at Carly Watson, the court-appointed attorney. She looked timid, uncertain, as if she had already decided he couldn't win. Relying on her meant certain defeat. He clenched his fists, drew a deep breath, and lifted his chin. Your Honor, I will represent myself. A hush fell over the courtroom, then erupted into hushed whispers. Prosecutor Payne smirked, as if watching an unfolding spectacle, but Marcus didn't care. He had just bet everything on himself. The trial was set in motion immediately. No time to prepare, no safety net. He had only minutes to turn the tide. Prosecutor Payne stepped forward, exuding confidence, as if the case had already been decided. He didn't spare Marcus a single glance, focusing instead on the jury as he held up a folder. Ladies and gentlemen, I present our first piece of evidence, the defendant's fingerprints on the stolen vehicle. A forensic expert entered, placing a thick stack of documents on the evidence table. On the large courtroom screen, a crisp image of a fingerprint appeared. These prints were found on the car's door handle, dashboard, and gear shift, Payne continued. There is no doubt the defendant was inside this vehicle, so members of the jury, what is there to debate? For a moment, Marcus felt the weight of the room shift against him. The jury's eyes bore into him with suspicion. He had to push back, immediately. Marcus stood, walking toward the evidence table with measured steps, his expression unwavering. Your Honor, I'm not denying that my fingerprints are on that car, but I have one crucial question. When were they left there? The courtroom fell silent. I request clarification from the forensic expert. Is there any way to determine exactly when my fingerprints appeared on that vehicle? The forensic expert hesitated, casting a quick glance at Payne. No, we cannot determine the precise time, he admitted. Marcus nodded, turning to the jury. I've been inside that car before, Benjamin Carter, the car's owner, and I rode together a few weeks before the theft. My fingerprints could have been there long before that night. There's no proof I drove the car that night. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Monroe frowned, but motioned for the proceedings to continue. Payne clenched his jaw, but wasn't ready to back down. The prosecutor quickly called his key witness, Officer Brett Simmons. A middle-aged man in police uniform took the stand, nodding to the judge before fixing Marcus with a cold stare. Your Honor, I personally saw the defendant driving the stolen car away from the Exxon gas station that night, Simmons said firmly. He sped off. I gave chase but couldn't catch up. Marcus folded his arms, letting Simmons finish. Then he stepped forward, moving with the ease of a seasoned attorney. Officer Simmons, are you certain it was me driving that car? Absolutely. Marcus narrowed his eyes, a faint smirk forming. Good. Then I have a request. I'd like to see the GPS data from your patrol car that night. Payne's expression darkened. Objection. This request is irrelevant. Overruled, Judge Monroe interjected. The defendant has the right to examine evidence. A court officer quickly retrieved the GPS data from the central system. As the screen displayed the officer's location at the time of the incident, the courtroom held its breath. Marcus stepped closer, pointing at the screen. This shows where Officer Simmons's patrol car actually was at 10:45 p.m., the time of the theft. According to this data, he was nowhere near the Exxon station. A wave of gasps spread through the room. Some jury members exchanged glances. Payne's eyes darted nervously, while Simmons paled. Marcus turned to the officer, locking eyes with him. So tell me, officer, how exactly did you see me driving if you weren't even at the scene? Simmons stammered, his gaze shifting. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. Judge Monroe banged the gavel, calling for order. But the damage was done. The prosecution's star witness had just lost all credibility. Marcus knew this was his moment. He had weakened the prosecution's case, but now he needed a finishing blow. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to call a new witness, Benjamin Carter, the actual owner of the stolen vehicle. Payne shot up. Objection! This witness was not on the original list. Overruled. Monroe cut in again. The witness has direct relevance to the case. Bring him in. A few moments later, the courtroom doors swung open. Benjamin Carter, a middle-aged man with graying hair, stepped forward, looking slightly uneasy but composed. Marcus approached, his voice firm. Mr. Carter, please tell the court, did you see the person who stole your car? Yes, Benjamin answered without hesitation. I remember clearly. Can you describe him? Benjamin took a deep breath. He was a white male, around 30, with a dragon tattoo on his neck. The room froze. Marcus turned to the jury, his gaze sharp. Ladies and gentlemen, I am a black teenager. I have no dragon tattoo, and I am not the thief. Payne stood motionless. Monroe furrowed his brow, flipping through the case files as if double-checking everything. In the gallery, Marcus's mother clutched her hands together, tears welling in her eyes. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Her son had turned the case around. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Prosecutor Gerald Payne, once brimming with confidence, now stood frozen, his grip tightening around the case files. He couldn't believe that a 20-year-old had dismantled his entire case with just a few sharp questions. Judge Monroe, who had shown clear bias against Marcus from the start, couldn't hide his surprise. He removed his glasses, tapping his fingers on the bench as he thought. Mr. Payne, do you have any rebuttal to these recent revelations? Payne swallowed hard, then straightened his posture. Your Honor, while there was an inconsistency in Officer Simmons' testimony, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the vehicle. Furthermore, An officer may misremember details, but that doesn't mean the entire case was fabricated. Marcus chuckled softly, shaking his head. Misremember details, Your Honor? A professional police officer lied under oath, and the prosecution is still clinging to this case? Let me ask you something, Mr. Payne. Do you truly believe I'm guilty? Payne stiffened. He hadn't expected Marcus to confront him so directly. That's not for me to decide. But it is about the truth. Marcus cut him off, his voice firm. And the truth is, this entire case was a setup. The jury murmured among themselves. Some nodded, while others flipped through their notes, reevaluating the evidence. Payne glanced around desperately, searching for something, anything, to salvage his case, but there was nothing left. Judge Monroe cleared his throat and slammed his gavel. Order! I propose a recess to review the evidence But Marcus couldn't let that happen. He knew that if the court adjourned, Payne would use the time to find a way to strike back. This was the moment. Marcus stepped forward, his voice ringing through the courtroom. No, Judge Monroe, I object to any delays. I have clear proof that this case needs to be dismissed, right here, right now. Monroe narrowed his eyes. What proof are you referring to? Marcus turned sharply and pointed straight at Officer Simmons. I move to dismiss Officer Brett Simmons' entire testimony because it's fabricated, and I will prove it, right here, right now. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously, some already pulling out their phones to capture the moment. Judge Monroe crossed his arms. Proceed. Marcus locked eyes with Simmons, his stare unflinching. Officer Simmons, you testified that you pursued me that night, but according to GPS data, you weren't at the scene. So tell me, if you weren't there, how did you see me driving? Simmons opened his mouth, but no words came out. Marcus didn't stop. He turned to Payne. Mr. Payne, were you aware that Officer Simmons committed perjury? Payne shook his head rapidly, his voice cracking. I had no knowledge of this. Marcus let out a short laugh and faced Judge Monroe. So what do we have now? A cop who lied, a prosecutor who can't control his own case, a witness, Mr. Benjamin Carter, who confirmed I wasn't the thief, and most importantly, zero evidence that I was behind the wheel that night. Marcus paused, scanning the room, letting the weight of his words sink in. If any of you still believe I'm guilty, then tell me. What proof do you have? Silence. No one spoke. Because the truth was, there was no proof. Judge Monroe slowly rested his hand on the gavel, exhaling deeply. In his long career, he had presided over countless trials, but never had a defendant defended himself, and one like this. Jury, Monroe said, his voice steady. I don't think we need any further deliberation. Marcus closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He knew he had won. The tension in the courtroom remained heavy after Marcus's decisive counterattack. The jurors exchanged glances, some nodding as if they had finally pieced everything together. But Prosecutor Gerald Payne wasn't ready to give up. He clenched his fists, struggling to regain his professional composure, then stepped forward toward Judge Monroe. Your Honor, I admit there were inconsistencies in Officer Simmons' testimony. However, I believe this issue lies with the police department, not the prosecution's office. If anyone is to be held accountable, it should be Officer Simmons and the investigative unit, not me, and certainly not the justice system. Marcus raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk on his lips. Mr. Payne, I appreciate how quickly you try to wash your hands of responsibility, but unfortunately, the truth isn't on your side. Payne turned sharply, his expression uneasy. What are you implying? Marcus picked up a folder, one he had asked his mother to gather for him, and flipped it open in front of the court. I thoroughly reviewed the investigative reports for this case, and I found something extremely suspicious. My case was processed unusually fast, faster than any other case of similar severity. Why was a routine case like this rushed to trial in just 10 days? The jury murmured. Some reporters were already typing furiously. Marcus locked eyes with Payne. Mr. Payne, who authorized this case to be fast-tracked to trial? Payne didn't respond right away. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he flipped through his own stack of documents before abruptly stopping. I don't recall. Marcus nodded, as if he had expected that answer. Then let me remind you, it was you. The courtroom erupted. Judge Monroe's face darkened as he turned to Payne. Mr. Payne, is this true? Payne stood frozen. Marcus pressed on. Why were you so eager to rush this case? Was it because you knew that if it were investigated properly, the truth would come to light? I, I was just following procedure, Payne snapped. Marcus shook his head. No, you violated procedure. And now, not only is Officer Simmons facing perjury charges, but you could lose your position as prosecutor for pushing a wrongful conviction. The jury was visibly shaken. Judge Monroe slammed his gavel. Order! Order in the court! He turned to Payne, his gaze stern. Mr. Payne, do you still wish to proceed with this prosecution? Payne stood motionless. He scanned the room, but there was no one left to back him up. Marcus took another step forward, his voice calm yet commanding. I request an immediate acquittal, and I also request a formal investigation into Officer Simmons' conduct. All eyes were on Judge Monroe. He looked at Payne, then at Marcus, and finally let out a long sigh. The courtroom was deathly silent as Judge Monroe struck his gavel one final time. The court finds the defendant, Marcus Reeves, not guilty. Marcus closed his eyes and took a deep breath, not because he had doubted the outcome, but because, after everything, he had won, and it hadn't been easy. His mother, Attorney Eleanor Reeves, burst into tears of joy. She rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her son, her voice trembling. You did it, Marcus. The jurors slowly rose from their seats. A few clapped softly, then the applause grew louder. A case that had seemed so straightforward had turned into a seismic shakeup of the legal system. Prosecutor Payne lowered his head, knowing his career might be over after this. Officer Simmons avoided eye contact with anyone. He knew an investigation into his conduct was now only a matter of time. Judge Monroe studied Marcus for a long moment before standing to leave. There was no more disdain in his eyes, only acknowledgement. Outside the courthouse, the massive doors swung open. Marcus stepped out. A barrage of flashing lights exploded in front of him. Reporters swarmed forward, shoving microphones in his direction. Marcus, can you share your thoughts on the case? Do you believe the justice system was truly fair to you? Marcus paused, scanning the faces around him. Supporters cheered his name, but inside, his thoughts weighed heavy. He had been acquitted. But how many more Marcus Reeves were still out there? How many never got the chance to defend themselves? Slowly he smiled, not out of victory, but because at that moment he knew he had found his true purpose. I just want to say one thing. Strength doesn't make you right. Weakness doesn't make you wrong. Everyone deserves to be protected under the law. The reporters kept writing, the cameras kept rolling, but Marcus only looked straight into the lens. His smile grew, steady and confident. The next time I walk into this courthouse, I'll be a lawyer. The screen fades to black. The final image, Marcus walking away through the crowd, no longer the accused, but a man with a mission,